4-year-old is offered a marshmallow. She's told she can eat it right now, or if she waits 15 minutes, she can have 2. That single moment of decision, eat or wait, turns out to be twice as powerful a predictor of that child's future SAT scores as her IQ, twice. Not talent, not genius, not privilege, but the ability to control a single impulse at age 4 predicted academic success 14 years later better than any intelligence test ever designed. This is the science of emotional intelligence. And what you're about to hear could change how you understand every relationship, every decision, and every success or failure in your life. This is Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. For over a century, we've been obsessed with one number, IQ. We test for it, sort children by it, hire based on it, and quietly assume it decides who wins and who loses at life. But Daniel Goleman, a Harvard-trained psychologist and longtime science reporter for the New York Times, spent years tracking a revolution in how scientists understand the human mind. What he found shattered the old assumptions. IQ contributes about 20% to the factors that determine success in life. 20%. That means the vast majority of what separates someone who thrives from someone who struggles has nothing to do with how well they score on a test. It has to do with a completely different set of skills, skills most of us were never taught, and that our schools largely ignore. So what are those skills? What fills the other 80%? Goleman calls it emotional intelligence. It's the ability to recognize what you're feeling and manage it. The ability to motivate yourself when things get hard, to read the emotions of the people around you, and to navigate relationships with skill and care. It's self-awareness, self-control, empathy, and social competence, the things that make someone not just smart, but wise. Over the next 2 hours, I'll walk you through every key idea in this remarkable book. We'll explore the hidden architecture of the emotional brain and why your amygdala can hijack your rational mind in a 1/12 of a second. We'll unpack the 5 core domains of emotional intelligence and discover why the most successful people in the world aren't necessarily the smartest, they're the most emotionally skilled. We'll look at how these abilities shape our marriages, our careers, our health, and even how long we live. And we'll ask the question Goleman asks on the final page of this book. A question that might be the most important one we face as a society. Let's begin. Section 1. Your two minds. The emotional brain. Picture a couple on a train in Louisiana. Gary and Mary Jane Chauncey are traveling with their 11-year-old daughter Andrea, who has cerebral palsy and uses a wheelchair. It's supposed to be a routine trip, but then a barge strikes a railroad bridge, weakening the structure, and the train plunges into the river. As water rushes into the sinking car, Gary and Mary Jane don't think about themselves. Their only thought is Andrea. Somehow, working together in the rising water, they manage to push their daughter through a window to the rescuers waiting outside, and then the car sinks beneath the surface. Gary and Mary Jane don't make it out. Goleman opens his book with this story because it captures something profound about what emotions actually are. From a purely rational standpoint, what the Chaunceys did makes no logical sense. They sacrificed their own survival for their child. But from the standpoint of the heart, it was the only choice they could make. That overwhelming flood of parental love overrode every self-preservation instinct written into their biology. And that, Goleman says, is what emotions were designed to do. They're not just feelings that wash over us, they're impulses to act. The very root of the word emotion comes from the Latin word meaning to move. Every emotion you've ever felt, anger, fear, joy, sadness, love, comes with a built-in action plan, hardwired by millions of years of evolution. Think about it. What happens in your body when you're angry? Blood flows to your hands, your heart rate spikes, adrenaline surges through your system. Your body is literally preparing to fight. What about fear? Blood rushes to your legs, preparing you to run. Your face goes pale as blood diverts away from it. Your brain fixates on the threat and nothing else. Happiness? Your brain quiets the circuits that generate worry and increases available energy. Sadness? Your metabolism slows, your interest in the world drops, creating a natural withdrawal that gives you time to grieve and adjust. Every single emotion, Goleman explains, triggers a distinct biological response that once kept our ancestors alive. But here's the catch. These emotional responses were shaped over the last 50,000 human generations. The last 500 generations, they've barely made a dent on our wiring. And the last 5, forget it. We're walking around in the modern world with an emotional operating system designed for the Pleistocene era. The hair-trigger anger that once helped our ancestors survive a predator attack now gets us into road rage incidents. The fear that kept us alive in the wilderness now paralyzes us before a work presentation. Goleman illustrates this mismatch with a story that still haunts me. 14-year-old Matilda Crabtree decided to play a prank on her parents. They'd been out visiting friends and she was supposed to be at a sleepover. She came home early, hid in a closet, and jumped out yelling, "Boo," when her parents walked in. Her father, Bobby, had heard noises. He didn't know Matilda was home. He grabbed his gun and went to investigate. When she leapt from the closet, he fired. Matilda died 12 hours later from a gunshot wound to the neck. Bobby Crabtree loved his daughter. There is no question about that. But the fear response, that ancient alarm system, fired before his rational brain could register her voice, her face, the fact that this was his child. The emotion moved faster than the thought, and that split-second gap between feeling and thinking is at the heart of everything Goleman wants us to understand. To grasp why this happens, you need to understand how the brain is built. And it starts with a tiny almond-shaped structure deep in the limbic system called the amygdala. Neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux, working at New York University, made a discovery that rewrote our understanding of the emotional brain. He found that when sensory information, what you see, hear, or feel, enters your brain, it travels first to a structure called the thalamus. From there, the conventional wisdom said, it gets routed up to the neocortex, the thinking brain, where it's analyzed and interpreted. Only then does it get sent to the limbic system for an emotional response. But Ledoux discovered something nobody expected. There's a second pathway, a shortcut. A smaller bundle of neurons runs directly from the thalamus to the amygdala, bypassing the thinking brain entirely. This means the amygdala can receive raw sensory data and start triggering a response before the neocortex has even begun to figure out what's happening. In a rat's brain, this shortcut fires in about 12 milliseconds. The full route through the cortex takes roughly twice as long. That might seem trivial. We're talking thousandths of a second. But in evolutionary terms, those milliseconds were the difference between life and death. This is what Goleman calls an emotional hijacking. The amygdala sounds the alarm, floods the body with stress hormones, and commandeers the brain before the rational mind can weigh in. It's why Bobby Crabtree shot before he could see. It's why you've said things in anger you immediately regretted. It's why a Vietnam veteran can hear a car backfire and be transported instantly back to a battlefield that existed decades ago. But here's what makes the emotional brain so fascinating and so frustrating. This shortcut is fast, but it's sloppy. It doesn't get the full picture. It gets a rough sketch, just enough to recognize potential danger and react. That's great when you're facing an actual threat. It's not so great when you're misreading your partner's neutral comment as an attack or your coworker's innocent email as a slight. So the question is, if the amygdala can hijack us, who manages the amygdala? The answer is the prefrontal cortex, the area just behind your forehead. This is the brain's emotional manager. It receives the same sensory information, but through the slower, more thorough route. It analyzes what's happening, weighs the options, and modulates the amygdala's response. When it works well, it's like a wise parent stepping in to say, "Hold on, let's think about this before we react." Goleman shares a perfect example. A mother is lying in bed near midnight, tense because her 6-year-old daughter Jessica is sleeping over at a friend's house for the very first time. The phone rings. The mother snatches it up, heart pounding, and blurts out, "Jessica," certain something terrible has happened. A woman's voice on the other end says, "Oh, I think this must be a wrong number." The mother pauses, takes a breath, and in a polite, measured tone asks, "What number were you calling?" That shift from panic to composure in a single breath is the prefrontal cortex kicking in. The amygdala fired the alarm. The prefrontal cortex recognized the false alarm and cooled everything down. But what happens when this circuit is damaged? Neurologist Antonio Damasio studied patients whose connections between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala had been severed. Their IQ was untouched. They could reason perfectly, but they could not make decisions. Even something as simple as scheduling an appointment became impossible because without emotional input, every option felt exactly the same. They had no preferences, no gut feelings, no sense of what mattered. And this is where Goleman delivers one of his most counterintuitive insights. Feelings are not the enemy of rational thinking. They are essential to it. Without emotions guiding us, we can't prioritize, we can't decide, we can't act. The old idea that the rational mind should override the emotional one is completely backwards. The goal isn't to silence your emotions, it's to harmonize them with your thinking, to bring intelligence to your emotions and emotion to your intelligence. That harmony is what Goleman means by emotional intelligence. And understanding the architecture of the emotional brain is the first step toward building it. Section 2. When smart is dumb. What is emotional intelligence? Jason was a sophomore at a Florida high school, straight A's, fixated on getting into Harvard Medical School. When his physics teacher gave him an 80 on a quiz, a B, Jason didn't see a bump in the road. He saw his dream dying, so he brought a butcher knife to school and stabbed his teacher in the collarbone. A panel of psychologists declared Jason temporarily insane. He was found innocent. He transferred to a private school and graduated at the top of his class with a grade point average of 4.614. Way beyond A+, but his old teacher noted something chilling. Jason never apologized. He never even acknowledged that what he'd done was wrong. Goleman uses this story to ask a deceptively simple question. How can someone so obviously intelligent do something so obviously dumb? The answer, he says, is that academic intelligence has almost nothing to do with emotional life. The brightest people can be terrible pilots of their own lives. The most dazzling IQ can coexist with the most reckless impulsivity, the most crippling anxiety, the most destructive anger. Think about it. We've all known someone like this. Brilliant at their work, but a disaster in their relationships. Top of their class, but constantly making choices that leave them miserable. The grades say one thing, the life says another. The data backs this up. When researchers tracked 95 Harvard students from the 1940s into middle age, the men with the highest test scores in college were not particularly more successful than their lower-scoring peers, not in salary, productivity, status, or even life satisfaction. In another study, boys who grew up in poverty in a rough neighborhood near Boston showed the same pattern. IQ had almost no relationship to how well they did at work or in the rest of their lives. What mattered instead were childhood abilities like handling frustration, controlling emotions, and getting along with other people. And here's one that really stopped me. Researchers tracked 81 high school valedictorians, the top students in their graduating classes. Every single one had the highest grades in their school, but by their late 20s, they had climbed to only average levels of success in their professions. Being a valedictorian, one of the researchers explained, tells you that a person is exceedingly good at achievement as measured by grades. It tells you nothing about how they handle the challenges that real life throws at them. So if IQ isn't the whole story, what else is going on? In the early 1990s, two psychologists, Peter Salovey at Yale and John Mayer at the University of New Hampshire, proposed a framework that changed the conversation. They mapped out what they called emotional intelligence, and they broke it into 5 core domains. The first is knowing your emotions, self-awareness. Can you recognize what you're feeling as you're feeling it? This sounds simple, but as we'll see, many people have no idea what's actually happening inside them emotionally. The second is managing your emotions. Once you know what you're feeling, can you handle it? Can you soothe your own anxiety, shake off gloom, recover from setbacks? People who can't manage their emotions are constantly battling internal storms. People who can bounce back quickly from almost anything. The third is motivating yourself. Can you marshal your emotions in the service of a goal? Can you delay gratification, stifle impulsiveness, and push through frustration? This domain underpins achievement in every area of life. The fourth is recognizing emotions in others. Empathy. Can you read what someone else is feeling from their tone of voice, their posture, their facial expression? This is the fundamental people skill. Without it, you're flying blind in every relationship. And the fifth is handling relationships. This is the art of managing emotions in other people, the skills that make you effective as a friend, a partner, a leader, a collaborator. Now, here's what makes this framework so powerful. These aren't fixed traits. They aren't set in stone by your genes. They're skills, and like any skill, they can be learned, practiced, and improved. Goleman draws a vivid contrast between two pure types to make this real. The high IQ type, separated from emotional intelligence, is almost a caricature of the intellectual, ambitious, productive, and predictable, but also critical, condescending, emotionally cold, and uncomfortable with intimacy. The high EQ type is socially poised, outgoing, and cheerful. They commit to people and causes. They're sympathetic and caring. They have rich emotional lives, and they're comfortable with themselves, with others, and with the world. Most of us, of course, are some blend of both. But the point is this: to the degree that a person has both cognitive and emotional intelligence, these qualities merge and strengthen each other. And when we have to choose which one adds more to making us fully human, Goleman's answer is clear. So the question becomes, can you actually build these skills? Can you become more self-aware, more empathic, better at managing what you feel? The answer, as we're about to discover, is a resounding yes. But it starts with the most basic skill of all: the ability to look inward and honestly see what's there. Section 3. Know thyself. The power of self-awareness. There's an old Japanese tale about a belligerent samurai who once challenged a Zen master to explain the concept of heaven and hell. The monk looked at him with contempt and said, "You're nothing but a lout. I can't waste my time with the likes of you." The samurai's honor was attacked. His face flushed red. He pulled his sword from its sheath and raised it above his head, ready to strike. "I could kill you for your impertinence." The monk looked at him calmly and said, "That is hell." The samurai froze. In a single instant, he saw the truth, the blind fury that had consumed him, the rage that had taken over his body and his mind. He lowered his sword, he sheathed it, he bowed deeply, overwhelmed with gratitude for the insight. "And that," said the monk, "is heaven." That moment, when the samurai suddenly became aware of his own emotional state, when he saw the rage instead of just being consumed by it, is the keystone of everything Goleman teaches about emotional intelligence. He calls it self-awareness, and he argues it is the single most important emotional skill a person can develop. Self-awareness sounds deceptively simple. Of course I know what I'm feeling, you might think. But Goleman says take a closer look. Think about the last time you were in a terrible mood for hours and couldn't quite say why. Think about the times you snapped at someone and only realized later that you'd been carrying frustration from something else entirely. Think about how many decisions you've made, who to trust, what job to take, when to walk away, where you told yourself you were being rational, but something deeper was really driving the choice. The truth is, much of our emotional life happens below the surface of awareness. Feelings stir in us, shape our perceptions, and guide our behavior without our conscious participation. And the gap between what we're actually feeling and what we think we're feeling can be enormous. Psychologist John Mayer, one of the architects of emotional intelligence theory, found that people tend to fall into three distinct styles when it comes to handling their emotions. The first is the self-aware type. These people have a kind of ongoing mindfulness about what's happening inside them. When a bad mood hits, they notice it. They don't get swept away. They recognize the feeling, name it, and that very act of recognition gives them options. They can choose how to respond rather than simply reacting on autopilot. Not surprisingly, these people tend to have a positive outlook on life, good psychological health, and the ability to get out of bad moods relatively quickly. The second type Mayer calls the engulfed. These are people who feel swamped by their emotions. Their moods take charge, and they have very little perspective on what's happening to them. They feel helpless, out of control, and they rarely try to escape a bad mood because they don't believe they can. They're not watching the storm. They're inside it. The third type is the accepting. They see their emotions clearly enough, but they take a hands-off approach. Whatever they're feeling, they let it run its course without trying to change anything. Some of these people are simply in good moods most of the time, so there's nothing to fix. But others are stuck in dark moods and have resigned themselves to staying there. Now, at the far end of the self-awareness spectrum, Goleman describes a condition that's more common than you might expect. It's called alexithymia, a Greek term meaning literally without words for feelings. People with alexithymia don't just struggle to express what they feel, they genuinely don't know what they feel. When pressed, they might say they feel awful, but they can't tell you whether that means anxious, sad, angry, or ashamed. It's all one undifferentiated cloud of discomfort. Goleman introduces us to a surgeon named Gary. Brilliant, accomplished, successful by every external measure. But his fiancée, Ellen, was increasingly frustrated because Gary was emotionally flat. He could talk brilliantly about science and art, but the moment the conversation turned to feelings, his own or anyone else's, he went silent. He didn't know what he felt. He didn't know what she felt. As his therapist observed, people like Gary bore everybody. That's why their wives send them into treatment. But if Gary represents one extreme, a person cut off from their own inner life, Goleman introduces us to the opposite extreme to show that the absence of feeling is just as devastating as being overwhelmed by it. A man named Elliot was a successful corporate lawyer until doctors removed a brain tumor, along with part of his prefrontal cortex. After the surgery, Elliot's IQ was untouched. He could reason, he could analyze, but he had lost something that seemed unrelated to intelligence and turned out to be inseparable from it. He'd lost the ability to feel. Elliot could narrate the story of how his career collapsed, how his wife left him, how he squandered his savings on foolish investments, and how he ended up living in a spare bedroom at his brother's house. And he could tell you all of it without a flicker of sadness, frustration, or regret. His neurologist, Antonio Damasio, said he felt more upset hearing Elliot's story than Elliot did living it. And here's the part that shocked the scientific world. Elliot couldn't make decisions, even trivial ones. When Damasio tried to schedule their next appointment and offered several dates and times, Elliot spent half an hour weighing the pros and cons of each option and couldn't choose. He could see the logic of every possibility, but without any feeling to tell him which option he preferred, every choice carried the same weight. Everything was neutral. This is one of the most important insights in the entire book. We've been taught to believe that emotions cloud our judgment, that the best decisions come from cold, hard logic, that feelings get in the way. But Damasio's research proved the opposite. Without feelings, we can't decide anything. We can't prioritize. We can't sense which path feels right and which feels wrong. The gut feeling, what Damasio calls a somatic marker, isn't a distraction from good thinking. It's the foundation of it. Every time you get that subtle tug in your stomach that says something isn't right, that's your emotional brain drawing on a lifetime of experience, sending you a signal faster than your rational mind can calculate it. Every time you feel drawn to one job over another, one person over another, one path over another, without being able to fully explain why, that's emotional intelligence at work beneath the surface. Self-awareness, then, is not some soft, touchy-feely concept. It's the ability to access a system of intelligence that your rational mind depends on but cannot replace. It's the first domino. Without it, every other emotional skill, managing your feelings, motivating yourself, reading other people, navigating relationships, falls apart. And that brings us to the natural next question. Once you can see what you're feeling, what do you do about it? Section 4. Passion's Slaves. Managing your emotions. The goal, Goleman makes clear, is not to suppress your emotions. Every feeling has its value. A life without passion would be a wasteland, flat, gray, and disconnected from everything that gives existence its depth. The goal is appropriate emotion, feeling proportionate to the circumstances, not too little and not too much. As Aristotle put it more than 2,000 years ago, the challenge is not whether to feel, It's whether you can feel the right thing at the right time, to the right degree, for the right purpose. That is the art. So where does managing emotions actually begin? Goleman starts with the trickiest one, the one that hijacks us most often and does the most damage: anger. University of Alabama psychologist Dolph Zillman spent years mapping the anatomy of rage, and what he found explains so much about why anger is uniquely dangerous. The trigger, he discovered, is almost always a sense of being endangered. Not necessarily physical danger, but a threat to self-esteem, dignity, or a sense of being treated fairly. Being insulted, being disrespected, being treated as though you don't matter. These perceptions trigger a cascade in the brain that unfolds in two waves. The first wave is a rush of catecholamines, stress chemicals that generate a quick burst of energy. This is the fight wing of the fight or flight response. It lasts for minutes, but the second wave is slower and more insidious. The adrenocortical system creates a general background of agitation that can last for hours, even days. Think of it as an emotional temperature that stays elevated long after the initial spark. And this is where things get dangerous, because that lingering agitation becomes a foundation for the next anger. Every subsequent irritation, a traffic jam, a rude comment, a child's whining, hits you when you're already primed. The catecholamine burst from each new annoyance rides the momentum of the one before it. A thought that would barely register when you're calm can trigger an explosion when you're already simmering. Goleman paints a small but vivid scene to show how this works. A mother in a supermarket is already stressed. Her 3-year-old is clinging to a box of Ninja Turtles cereal. "Put it back," she says, her tone tight. The boy whines. Her voice gets louder. Then the baby in the shopping cart drops a jar of jelly. It shatters on the floor. And that's it. The mother snaps. She slaps the baby, grabs the boy, slams the cereal onto the nearest shelf, scoops him up, and rushes down the aisle with the cart careening in front of her. The stress from her day was the first wave. The argument with her son added another. The shattered jelly was the final escalation, each provocation building on the hormonal momentum of those before it, until the emotional brain overrode everything else. So how do you stop the escalation? Zillman found 2 primary methods. The first is cognitive reappraisal, challenging the thoughts that are fueling the anger. This works because anger is fed by a train of self-righteous thinking. "He has no right to treat me like that. She always does this. I can't believe they got away with that." Each thought is like a log thrown on the fire, but if you can catch those thoughts early, before the rage reaches full intensity, and reframe the situation, the fire doesn't get the fuel it needs. In one clever experiment, a researcher had volunteers insulted by a rude Confederate. They were furious. But before they had a chance to retaliate, another person came in and mentioned to the rude man that he had a phone call. After he left, she explained that he'd been under terrible pressure, anxious about his upcoming exams. He was rude to her too, she said, but she understood he was having an awful time. Just like that, the volunteers' anger dissolved. When they were given the chance to retaliate, they chose compassion instead. The information didn't change what happened. It changed how they interpreted what happened. And that was enough. But here's the catch. This only works at moderate levels of anger. Once you've crossed a certain threshold, once the amygdala has fully hijacked the brain, you can't think clearly enough to reframe anything. Zillman found that at peak rage, people dismissed any mitigating information entirely. They couldn't hear it. Their rational mind had been swamped, which is why the second strategy matters so much. Cooling off, physically removing yourself from the triggering situation and giving your body time to recover. That means walking away, going for a run, taking deep breaths, doing something, anything that interrupts the cycle. Zillman's research suggests that a minimum of 20 minutes is needed for the hormonal surge to dissipate. And here's what you cannot do during that 20 minutes. You cannot keep thinking about what made you angry. Distraction works because it interrupts the train of thought that feeds the fire. But if you use the cooling off period to rehearse every injustice, to replay the argument, to sharpen your counterattack, you're not cooling off, you're reloading. And now for the myth that Goleman takes apart with special care: catharsis. The idea that venting your anger, yelling, punching a pillow, screaming at the person who offended you, releases the pressure and makes you feel better. The research is unequivocal. Venting anger almost always makes it worse, not better. Outbursts of rage pump up the emotional brain's arousal, leaving you feeling more angry, not less. When people told researchers about times they lashed out at the person who provoked them, the net effect was to prolong the mood rather than end it. A Tibetan teacher named Chogyam Trungpa was once asked how best to handle anger. His response was beautifully simple. Don't suppress it, but don't act on it. Acknowledge the feeling, let it exist, and then choose what to do next, instead of letting the feeling choose for you. Now, anger isn't the only emotion that needs managing. Goleman also takes a careful look at anxiety, the chronic worrier's prison, and depression, the mood that feeds on itself. Worry, he explains, is anxiety's engine. At its core, worry is a rehearsal. The mind spins through possible dangers, trying to anticipate threats and prepare for them. That's useful, in moderation. The problem is when it becomes chronic, when worry locks into a loop, recycling the same fears without ever reaching a solution. Pennsylvania state psychologist Thomas Borkovec found something remarkable about chronic worriers. Their worry actually serves as a kind of mental anesthetic. By immersing themselves in worried thoughts, they partially suppress the physical sensations of anxiety. The heart races a little less, the stomach clenches a little less, and because that suppression feels like relief, the worry gets reinforced. It becomes a habit, a mental addiction. The antidote, Borkovec found, is a combination of self-awareness and healthy skepticism. First, catch the worry as early as possible, before it builds momentum. Then challenge it. Is it really likely that the feared event will happen? Is there really nothing you can do? Are there other ways of looking at the situation? This combination of mindfulness and critical thinking creates a mental state that's incompatible with spiraling anxiety. As for depression, Goleman highlights one of its most insidious features: rumination. The depressed mind obsesses. It replays what went wrong. It catalogs every failure, every loss, every shortcoming. And each cycle of rumination deepens the mood, making it harder to escape. Psychologist Susan Nolan Hoeksma found that women are far more prone to ruminate than men, which may partly explain why women are diagnosed with depression at twice the rate. Men, she found, are more likely to distract themselves when they feel down, though their method of distraction, unfortunately, is often alcohol. The most effective strategies for lifting depression, Goleman reports, are distraction, exercise, cognitive reframing, and social connection. One of the most powerful, and one of the rarest, is helping someone else. Because depression feeds on self-preoccupation, and turning your attention to another person's pain breaks that cycle in a way almost nothing else can. What ties all of this together, managing anger, anxiety, and sadness, is a single principle. You may not be able to choose what emotions hit you or when, but you have far more control than you think over how long they last and what you do with them. That control is the second pillar of emotional intelligence, and it unlocks everything that comes next. Section 5. The Master Aptitude: Motivation, Hope, and Flow. In my freshman year of college, I sat down for a calculus exam I hadn't studied for, and as I opened the blue exam book, something happened that I've never forgotten. My mind froze completely. I didn't attempt to patch together answers. I didn't daydream. I sat motionless, paralyzed by terror, for the entire hour, staring at the page while my heart pounded in my ears. That's Goleman's own story, and he uses it to illustrate a truth that every student, every performer, every person who has ever faced a high-stakes moment already knows in their bones. When emotions overwhelm you, thinking stops. Anxiety doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it sabotages the cognitive machinery you need to succeed. Neuroscientists call this machinery working memory. It's the mental workspace where you hold the information you need right now: the digits of a phone number, the thread of an argument, the steps of a problem. The prefrontal cortex manages working memory, but when the limbic system, the emotional brain, sends distress signals flooding into that same prefrontal cortex, the workspace gets crowded. The signal gets drowned in noise. And when that happens, you literally cannot think straight. But here's the other side of the coin. Just as negative emotions can sabotage thinking, the right emotional state can supercharge it. Enthusiasm, confidence, persistence in the face of failure. These aren't just nice feelings. They're cognitive advantages, and the research Goleman presents to prove it is some of the most striking in the entire book. Let's go back to those marshmallows. Psychologist Walter Mischel designed this experiment in the 1960s at a preschool on the Stanford University campus. 4-year-olds were brought into a room, one at a time, and offered a deal. You can have one marshmallow right now, or if you wait until the researcher comes back from an errand, about 15 to 20 minutes, you can have 2. Some children grabbed the single marshmallow almost before the researcher left the room. But others, and these are the ones who changed our understanding of human potential, found ways to resist. They covered their eyes so they wouldn't have to look at the temptation. They rested their heads in their arms. They sang to themselves, played games with their fingers, even tried to fall asleep. One child started talking to the marshmallow, as if negotiating with it. These children understood something at 4 years old that many adults never learn. That you can change how you feel by changing what you pay attention to. Here's what made this experiment legendary. Mischel tracked these children down 12 to 14 years later as they were finishing high school. The emotional and social differences between the grabbers and the waiters were dramatic. The children who had resisted at age 4 were now, as teenagers, more socially competent, more self-assured, and better at coping with frustration. They were less likely to fall apart under stress, more likely to embrace challenges, and more trustworthy and dependable. They took initiative. They persevered. The children who had grabbed the marshmallow showed a very different profile. They were more likely to shy away from social contact, more stubborn and indecisive, more easily upset by frustrations. They thought of themselves as unworthy. They were mistrustful and resentful, and they still couldn't delay gratification. But the most astonishing finding was academic. The children who waited longest at age 4 scored, on average, 210 points higher on the SAT than those who grabbed immediately. 210 points. And impulse control at age 4 turned out to be twice as powerful a predictor of SAT scores as IQ at age 4. Think about what that means. The ability to resist a marshmallow at age 4 told researchers more about a child's academic future than an intelligence test. Not because impulse control is a form of intelligence, but because it determines how effectively a child can use whatever intelligence they have. If you can't sit still, if you can't focus, if you can't push through the boring parts to get to the mastery, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you won't reach your potential. This is why Goleman calls emotional self-regulation the master aptitude. It doesn't replace talent. It multiplies it, and this multiplying effect shows up in a quality that researchers have only recently begun to study with scientific rigor: hope. Psychologist C.R. Snyder at the University of Kansas defines hope with more precision than most of us use in everyday language. Hope isn't just sunny optimism. It's the belief that you have both the will and the way to accomplish your goals, the motivation and the method, the desire and the strategy. People with high hope don't just wish for things, they actively look for paths forward. When one route is blocked, they find another. When a task seems overwhelming, they break it into smaller pieces. Snyder tested this by giving college students a hypothetical scenario. You set a goal of getting a B in a course, but your first exam comes back as a D. What do? The students with high hope said they would study harder, try new strategies, find a tutor. They could imagine multiple paths to a better outcome. Students with moderate hope had some ideas but lacked the determination to follow through. And students with low hope simply gave up. They couldn't see any way forward. When Snyder compared students' hope scores with their actual grades, hope turned out to be a better predictor of first semester performance than SAT scores. Students with roughly the same intellectual ability got dramatically different results depending on whether they believed they could find a way through difficulty or believed they were stuck. A near cousin of hope is optimism. Martin Seligman, a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, spent decades studying how people explain their failures to themselves. Optimists, he found, see failure as temporary, specific, and changeable. I used the wrong approach. That person was having a bad day. I'll do it differently next time. Pessimists see failure as permanent, pervasive, and personal. I'm no good at this. Nothing ever works out for me. This is who I am. Seligman tested these theories with Olympic swimmer Matt Biondi. Heading into the 1988 Games, sports writers predicted Biondi would match Mark Spitz's 7 gold medals. Instead, he finished a heartbreaking third in his first event. Then he was edged out by another swimmer in his second event. Commentators speculated that the defeats would crush Biondi's spirit for the rest of the competition. But Seligman had tested Biondi for optimism beforehand, and he predicted exactly the opposite. Biondi came roaring back and won gold in each of his next 5 events. His optimism wasn't a personality quirk, it was a performance advantage. The ability to interpret setback as a challenge rather than a sentence. Seligman found the same pattern in insurance sales at MetLife. Being able to handle rejection gracefully is everything in that business. About 3/4 of new insurance salesmen quit within their first 3 years. But when Seligman tested new agents for optimism, the results were staggering. Optimists outsold pessimists by 37% in their first 2 years, and pessimists quit at twice the rate. MetLife was so impressed that they hired a special group of applicants who had scored high on optimism but failed the company's standard screening tests. This group, the ones who shouldn't have been hired, outsold the pessimists by 21% in the first year and 57% in the second. Ask yourself, how much of your own success has depended not on what you know, but on how you respond when things go wrong? How much has been determined not by your talent, but by your ability to keep going when talent alone wasn't enough? And now we arrive at what may be the most beautiful expression of emotional intelligence, a state that athletes call the zone, that musicians describe as losing themselves in the music, and that psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi named flow. Flow is what happens when you're so absorbed in what you're doing that everything else disappears. Time stops. Self-consciousness evaporates. The task and the person merge into one seamless experience. A surgeon recalled being so deep in flow during an operation that when he finished, he noticed rubble on the floor. Part of the ceiling had caved in during the procedure and he hadn't noticed. That's how total the immersion can be. And here's what makes flow remarkable from a neuroscience perspective. In flow, the brain is actually quieter than normal. Less cortical arousal, not more. The brain enters what researchers call a cool state, with minimal neural energy expenditure. Skills that have been deeply practiced run on autopilot, freeing the mind to operate at peak efficiency. Flow sits in a narrow zone between boredom and anxiety. If a task is too easy, you lose interest. If it's too hard, you get anxious. But when the demands of the task slightly exceed your current skill level, when you're stretched but not overwhelmed, that's the gateway to flow. And that's also the gateway to mastery. Because flow feels so good that it becomes its own reward, pulling you to practice more, improve more, and push the boundaries of what you can do. Howard Gardner, the Harvard psychologist who developed the theory of multiple intelligences, sees flow as the healthiest possible model for education. When children are learning through flow, he says, they're motivated from the inside rather than by threat or reward. They're engaged because the work matters to them, not because someone will punish them if they don't do it. Gardner put it this way to Goleman: you have to find something you like and stick to it. Flow is the signal that a kid is engaged in a task that's right for them. When kids get bored in school, they fight and act up. When they're overwhelmed, they get anxious. But when you match the challenge to the child's ability, learning becomes joyful. And that joy becomes the engine that drives them to get better and better. This is the vision at the heart of Goleman's argument. Emotional intelligence is not just one more soft skill to add to the list. It is the foundation that every other skill rests on. It determines how well you can use your talent, your knowledge, and your time. It shapes whether you persist or give up, whether you stay focused or get derailed. whether you approach life with confidence or with dread. And so far, everything we've discussed has been about the inner world, understanding yourself, managing yourself, motivating yourself. But emotional intelligence doesn't stop at the border of your own skin. The next dimension takes us outward, into the space between people. It begins with the most ancient and most essential of all emotional skills, the ability to feel what someone else is feeling. Section 6. The roots of empathy. A 9-month-old baby named Hope is sitting on the floor when another infant nearby falls down and starts crying. Hope watches for a moment, and then tears begin welling up in her own eyes. She crawls across the floor, not toward the other baby, but toward her own mother, burying her face in her mother's lap as though she herself had been hurt. A few months later, a 15-month-old boy named Michael sees his friend Paul crying. Michael goes and gets his own teddy bear and offers it to Paul. When Paul keeps crying, Michael thinks for a moment, then goes and retrieves Paul's security blanket instead. These two small scenes were recorded by researchers studying the earliest roots of empathy. And what they reveal is something that might surprise you. Empathy is not something we learn in adulthood. It doesn't arrive with education or maturity. The seeds of it are present from the very first days of life. Virtually from birth, infants become upset when they hear another infant crying. It's one of the oldest emotional responses in human experience. A distress signal echoed back across the space between two tiny beings who don't yet even understand that they exist as separate people. But watch how it develops. By about 1 year old, children realize the misery belongs to someone else, not to them, but they're confused about what to do. A 1-year-old in one study brought his own mother to comfort a crying friend, completely ignoring the friend's mother who was standing right there. He knew someone needed help. He just didn't know whose help to offer. By 2, something remarkable happens. Children begin to grasp that another person's feelings are different from their own. They become more sensitive to cues about what the other person actually needs. They start tailoring their response, not just reaching out blindly, but paying attention. This is empathy unfolding in real time, stage by stage, across the first years of life. And Goleman argues it is the fundamental people skill, the ability upon which all rapport, all caring, all meaningful connection is built. Without empathy, you are emotionally tone-deaf. With it, the world of other people opens up to you in ways that no amount of raw intelligence can replicate. Now, here's a crucial point. Empathy builds on self-awareness. The more attuned you are to your own emotions, the more skilled you become at reading the emotions of others. This makes sense when you think about it. If you can't recognize fear in yourself, how would you recognize it in someone else's eyes? If you've never consciously felt the difference between sadness and anxiety in your own body, how would you detect that difference in someone else's tone of voice? Goleman points to the case of Gary, the emotionally flat surgeon we met earlier. Gary wasn't just blind to his own feelings, he was equally blind to his fiancée Ellen's feelings. When she spoke of love, he changed the subject. When she was upset, he offered helpful critiques instead of sympathy. He wasn't cruel. He simply couldn't perceive the emotional reality she was living in because he couldn't perceive his own. The science of how we read emotions is fascinating. Harvard psychologist Robert Rosenthal developed a test called the PUNS, the Profile of Nonverbal Sensitivity, where subjects watch video clips of a young woman expressing different emotions, with various channels of communication blocked or muffled. Some clips show only the face, some only body movements, some only tone of voice with words removed. What Rosenthal found across thousands of people in the United States and 18 other countries is that people who are better at reading these nonverbal cues are also better adjusted emotionally, more popular, more outgoing, and more sensitive in their relationships. Women on average outperform men at this skill, and here's what's important. There was virtually no relationship between this empathic ability and IQ or school achievement scores. Empathy is its own form of intelligence, separate from the academic kind. And think about what this means in everyday life. When someone's words say one thing but their tone says another, which one carries the truth? The research is clear. Over 90% of emotional communication is nonverbal. The real message is in how something is said, not what is said. The tightness in someone's jaw, the way they avoid your eyes, the slight catch in their voice. Most of us read these signals without even knowing we're doing it, tacitly, below consciousness. But some people are far better at it than others. So where does empathy come from? Is it nature or nurture? Goleman turns to the work of Daniel Stern, a psychiatrist who spent years studying the microscopic emotional exchanges between mothers and infants, interactions so subtle they're invisible to the naked eye without video replay. Stern observed a mother named Sarah with her twin boys, Mark and Fred. From the time the twins were just 3 months old, Sarah treated them differently in ways she probably never noticed. With Fred, she would try to catch his gaze and hold it. When he looked away, she would pursue, trying again and again to lock eyes. Fred would turn away more emphatically, and Sarah would pursue harder, a cycle that often ended with Fred in tears. With Mark, it was completely different. Sarah let Mark break eye contact whenever he wanted. She didn't chase, she didn't insist, she followed his lead. By 1 year, the difference was unmistakable. Fred was fearful and dependent. He couldn't look other people in the eye. Mark was confident and direct. He met people's gaze and smiled. Stern calls this process attunement, and he believes it is one of the most important emotional exchanges in human development. When a baby squeals with delight and the mother matches that delight with her voice, her expression, her energy, the baby learns something profound. My feelings are seen. My feelings are shared. I am not alone in what I feel. This happens about once a minute in healthy mother-infant interactions, and it doesn't require words. The mother might match the pitch of the baby's squeal with a coo. The baby shakes a rattle, and the mother gives a little shimmy in response. It's not imitation, it's resonance. The mother is saying, without words, I feel what you feel. But when this attunement is chronically absent, when a parent consistently fails to respond to a child's emotions, the consequences can be devastating. Children begin to avoid expressing the feelings that are never reciprocated. Over time, entire ranges of emotion can be obliterated from their repertoire. The child learns at the deepest level that certain parts of who they are simply don't matter to anyone. Even infants catch moods. 3-month-old babies of depressed mothers mirror their mother's emotional states during play, showing more anger, more sadness, and less curiosity than babies of mothers who aren't depressed. The emotional climate of the home is the first atmosphere the child breathes, and it shapes their emotional lungs for years to come. There's a hopeful note here, though. Stern emphasizes that relationships throughout life can reshape these patterns. A good friendship, a loving partner, an attuned therapist, all of these can serve as corrective experiences, rewiring what was poorly wired in childhood. The damage from early misattunement is real, but it is not permanent. Emotional learning never fully stops. But what about the complete absence of empathy? Goleman takes us to the darkest end of the spectrum, the world of criminal psychopaths, rapists, and child molesters. The psychological fault line common to all of them is the same. They cannot feel what their victims feel. And because they can't feel it, they can tell themselves whatever lies they need to justify what they do. Rapists tell themselves that women actually want to be assaulted. Child molesters convince themselves that they're showing love. Abusive parents call it discipline. Treatment programs that have shown the most promise work by restoring what was missing, empathy. Offenders read accounts of crimes like theirs, told from the victim's perspective. They watch videotapes of victims tearfully describing what it was like to be violated. They write about their own offenses from the victim's point of view. And then they go through a simulated reenactment, playing the role of the victim. The results are significant. Sex offenders who went through this empathy-based therapy had half the rate of reoffending compared to those who didn't. Feeling the victim's pain, even in simulation, makes it far harder to inflict that pain again. Empathy, then, is not a luxury. It is the emotional skill upon which morality itself depends. It is what makes us care when someone else is hurting. It is what makes us stop when we're about to do harm. And it is what connects us, across every difference of background, culture, and experience, to the shared reality of being human. Section 7. The Social Arts. Picture a train in suburban Tokyo during the late afternoon. An American named Terry Dobson, one of the first Westerners ever to study the martial art Aikido in Japan, is riding home after an 8-hour training session. He's in peak physical condition, and then a huge, drunk, filthy laborer gets on. The man starts terrorizing the passengers. He screams curses. He takes a swing at a woman holding a baby, sending her sprawling. An elderly couple jumps up and flees. The drunk grabs the metal pole in the center of the car with a roar and tries to rip it from its socket. Dobson feels called to act. He's trained for this. His teacher's words echo in his mind. Aikido is the art of reconciliation. But surely this is a legitimate use of force. He stands up slowly, deliberately. The drunk turns on him. A foreigner. You need a lesson in Japanese manners. But before either man can move, a voice rings out across the car. Oddly joyous, almost musical. Hey! Both men turn. A tiny old Japanese man, probably in his 70s, sits there in a kimono, beaming with delight. He waves the drunk over with a light gesture. Come here. The drunk lumbers toward him, fists clenched. Why the hell should I talk to you? What have you been drinking? The old man asks, his eyes sparkling. Sake. And it's none of your business. Oh, that's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. You see, I love sake too. Every night, my wife and I, she's 76, you know, we warm up a little bottle of sake and take it out into the garden, and we sit on an old wooden bench under a persimmon tree. He went on, describing his garden, the tree, the pleasures of an evening with his wife. And something extraordinary happened. The drunk's face began to soften, his fists unclenched. Yeah, I love persimmons too, the drunk murmured. Yes, the old man replied brightly. And I'm sure you have a wonderful wife. No, the drunk's voice broke. My wife died. And then the tears came. He launched into the story of losing his wife, his home, his job, and the shame that had consumed him. As Dobson reached his stop and got off the train, he turned for one last look. The drunk was sprawled across the seat with his head resting in the old man's lap. The old man was gently stroking his hair. Goleman calls this emotional brilliance. The old man did something that all the martial arts training in the world could not accomplish. He didn't overpower the drunk. He didn't confront him. He didn't try to reason with him or shame him into compliance. He connected with him. He found the human being beneath the rage and offered that person a bridge back to his own humanity. This is what Goleman means by the social arts, the ability to manage emotions in other people. It is the most complex and sophisticated expression of emotional intelligence because it requires all the others working together. You need self-awareness to manage your own reactions in the moment. You need emotional self-control to stay calm when others are not. You need empathy to read what the other person is actually feeling beneath the surface. And then you need the skill to respond in a way that shifts the emotional landscape. One of the most surprising findings in this field is just how contagious emotions are. When two people interact, the mood of the more emotionally expressive person tends to transfer to the more passive one. In one experiment, two strangers simply sat facing each other in silence for 2 minutes. When their moods were measured afterward, the more expressive partner's mood had infected the quieter one. Every time. This transmission happens largely below awareness. Psychologist Ulf Dimberg found that when people view a smiling face, their own facial muscles make subtle changes toward a smile, changes too small to see with the naked eye, but measurable with electronic sensors. The same happens with angry faces. We literally mirror the people around us, and that mirroring shapes how we feel. This is why some people leave you feeling drained after a conversation while others leave you feeling energized, even if you can't explain why. It's why a single pessimistic team member can drag down an entire project, and it's why the most effective leaders aren't necessarily the smartest or the most technically skilled. They're the ones who can set the emotional tone for an entire room. Goleman identifies 4 components of interpersonal intelligence. The first is organizing groups, the essential skill of leadership, the ability to coordinate the efforts of a network of people. The second is negotiating solutions, the mediator's talent for resolving disputes before they escalate. The third is personal connection, the gift of empathy and rapport that makes someone easy to work with and be around. And the fourth is social analysis, the ability to detect and understand people's deeper feelings, motives, and concerns. People who have all four of these are the ones we call charming, popular, or magnetic. They leave others feeling good. They read a room and know instinctively what's needed. They're the people you want on your team, at your table, in your corner. But there's a shadow side. Goleman warns about the social chameleon, the person whose interpersonal skills are so polished that they morph to fit every audience, saying whatever people want to hear, presenting a different face to every group. These people are often deeply liked, but they struggle with authentic intimacy because they've lost touch with who they actually are beneath the performance. The healthiest pattern is to balance social skill with self-knowledge, to be true to yourself while also being skillful with others. Integrity and emotional intelligence are not opposites. They're partners. The goal is not to manipulate people with your emotional skills, but to connect with them genuinely, in ways that serve both your needs and theirs. Section 8. Intimate enemies, marriage and emotional intelligence. If there's one relationship where emotional intelligence is tested every single day, it's marriage. And the data Goleman presents on what makes marriages succeed or fail is some of the most compelling and sobering in the entire book. Consider this. For couples who married in 1990, the projected likelihood that their marriage would end in divorce was close to 67%, 2 out of 3. And while social pressures that once kept unhappy couples together, the stigma of divorce, the economic dependence of wives, have eroded, the emotional bonds between partners haven't grown strong enough to fill the gap. Goleman traces this problem back to childhood, and to a difference that begins long before any couple ever meets. Boys and girls grow up in fundamentally separate emotional worlds. By the time they're 7 years old, almost no boys or girls say their best friend is of the opposite sex. They play different games, learn different rules, and develop very different emotional vocabularies. Girls play in small, intimate groups where the emphasis is on cooperation and minimizing hostility. If someone gets hurt during a game, the game stops while everyone gathers around to help. Boys play in larger groups where the emphasis is on competition. If someone gets hurt, he's expected to get out of the way so the game can continue. Parents reinforce this divide. Mothers discuss emotions more with daughters than with sons, with one exception. They discuss anger more with boys, usually as a cautionary warning. Girls develop facility with emotional language earlier. Boys learn to minimize emotions associated with vulnerability. By the time they're adolescents, girls are significantly more skilled at reading nonverbal emotional cues, and boys are significantly more skilled at hiding what they feel. And then these two emotional strangers get married and try to build a life together. The result, as researcher Ted Houston found, is a fundamental mismatch. For women, intimacy means talking things over, especially talking about the relationship itself. For men, intimacy means doing things together. During courtship, men are willing to spend time talking in ways that suit their partner's need for connection. But after the wedding, that time shrinks. The husband feels close while gardening side by side. The wife feels distant because they haven't had a real conversation in weeks. Psychologist John Gottman at the University of Washington has spent decades studying this dynamic with extraordinary scientific precision. In his laboratory, couples discuss their disagreements while sensors track their heart rate, blood pressure, and skin conductance. Cameras capture the micro-expressions that flit across their faces. The result is an emotional X-ray of the marriage, and Gottman's predictions are unnervingly accurate. In one study, he predicted which couples would divorce within 3 years with 94% accuracy. What he found is that it's not what couples fight about that determines whether a marriage survives. Every couple fights about money, housework, children, and sex. What matters is how they fight. Gottman identified 4 patterns that predict marital destruction. He calls them the 4 horsemen. The first is criticism, not just complaining about something your partner did, but attacking their character. The difference between "you forgot to pick up the dry cleaning and it really frustrated me," and "you're so thoughtless and self-centered, you never think about anyone but yourself." The second horseman is contempt. This is the most corrosive emotion in a marriage. It shows up as mockery, sarcasm, eye-rolling, sneering, any expression that communicates disgust with the other person's very being. In Gottman's research, when one partner's face showed contempt, The other partner's heart rate jumped 2 or 3 beats per minute, a physiological flinch. And if a wife showed disgust 4 or more times during a 15-minute conversation, the couple was likely to separate within 4 years. The third horseman is defensiveness, the refusal to take any responsibility, the constant deflection and counter-accusation. And the fourth is stonewalling, withdrawing completely, going blank, refusing to engage. In 85% of cases, it was the husband who stonewalled. Now here's where the gender differences become critical. Gottman found that men are more easily flooded by negative emotion in a conflict. Their heart rates spike faster and stay elevated longer. They secrete more adrenaline, triggered by lower levels of negativity from their wives. In a very real biological sense, conflict is harder on men. And stonewalling, that maddening withdrawal, is their way of protecting themselves from being overwhelmed. But when the husband stonewalls, the wife's heart rate shoots up. She feels shut out, ignored, and dismissed, so she escalates. More criticism, more intensity, trying to get a response, which triggers more flooding in him, which triggers more stonewalling, which triggers more frustration in her. And the spiral tightens until the marriage is strangling. So what saves a marriage? Goleman lays out the research, and the answer comes down to a handful of emotional competencies. The first is calming down. When your heart rate rises more than 10 beats above your resting rate, you're entering the flood zone. Thinking becomes muddled. Empathy evaporates. Everything your partner says sounds like an attack. The most important thing you can do for both of you is take a 20-minute break. Not 5 minutes, 20. That's how long it takes for the hormonal surge to genuinely dissipate. And during that break, you have to distract yourself. Go for a walk, breathe deeply, read something. Not rehearse your grievances. Every angry thought you replay during the break restarts the biological clock. The second is what Goleman calls detoxifying your self-talk. In the heat of an argument, toxic thoughts arise automatically. She doesn't care about me at all. He's completely selfish. These thoughts feel like objective observations, but they're interpretations, pessimistic ones, and they fuel the fire. Cognitive therapist Aaron Beck recommends catching these thoughts and challenging them. Has your partner never shown they care? Is this moment truly representative of who they are? The goal is not to deny your feelings, but to expand your perspective beyond the narrow lens that anger creates. The third is non-defensive listening. This might be the hardest skill of all, hearing what your partner is saying without immediately defending yourself or counterattacking. The technique called mirroring asks you to repeat back what your partner just said in your own words, including the feelings behind it, and check whether you got it right. The effect can be remarkable. People don't just want to be agreed with, they want to be understood, and being accurately mirrored can diffuse even intense anger because it communicates the one thing every person in a conflict most desperately needs to hear. I see you. I hear what you're feeling. It matters to me. The fourth is the art of non-defensive speaking, expressing your grievance without assassinating your partner's character. Psychologist Haim Janot offered a formula Goleman calls XYZ. When you did X, it made me feel Y, and I'd rather you did Z instead. It's specific. It's about the behavior, not the person. And it opens the door to change instead of slamming it shut with blame. Finally, there's validation. Finding moments, even small ones, to acknowledge what your partner is doing right. Saying something genuinely appreciative, showing that you see the good, even when the problems feel overwhelming. Research shows that compliments build emotional capital, a reservoir of positive feeling that helps couples survive the inevitable withdrawals of conflict. None of these skills come naturally when emotions are running high. That's exactly Goleman's point. They have to be practiced when you're calm, so they're available when you're not. They have to become habits, overlearned responses that can surface even when the emotional brain is screaming for you to fight or flee. Because here is the deepest truth about marriage and emotional intelligence. The patterns you bring into your closest relationship were shaped long before you ever met your partner. They were shaped in your childhood home, by how your parents handled their own emotions and each other's. And unless you become aware of those patterns and deliberately practice new ones, you will replay them, for better or worse, in every intimate relationship you ever have. Marriage, then, is not just a test of emotional intelligence, it's a classroom, a place where two people can learn, together, sometimes painfully, how to bring the best of their emotional selves to the person who matters most. The question is whether they'll show up for the lesson. Section 9. Managing with Heart. Emotional Intelligence at Work. In 1978, a plane was approaching Portland, Oregon, when the pilot, Captain Melbourne McBroom, noticed a problem with the landing gear. So he went into a holding pattern, circling the field at high altitude while he fiddled with the mechanism. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The fuel gauges crept steadily toward empty. McBroom's co-pilots could see what was happening. They could see the gauges dropping. They knew the plane was running out of fuel. But they said nothing, because Melbourne McBroom was a domineering boss with a volcanic temper, and the people who worked for him were terrified of his wrath. The plane crashed. 10 people died. Today, this story is told in every airline safety training program in the world. It became the case study that changed how pilots are trained, not just in technical skill, but in emotional competence. Because investigators found that in 80% of airline crashes, pilots make mistakes that could have been prevented if the crew had communicated openly. The problem isn't usually that the pilot doesn't know how to fly. The problem is that the emotional climate in the cockpit prevents people from speaking up when it matters most. The cockpit, Goleman points out, is a microcosm of every working organization. The same dynamics that killed those 10 passengers in Portland play out in offices, factories, hospitals, and boardrooms every day, just without the dramatic reality check of a crash. An intimidating boss whose temper silences dissent. A team where people are afraid to share bad news. A culture where emotional honesty is seen as weakness. The cost doesn't show up on the evening news. It shows up in missed deadlines, declining productivity, rising turnover, and the slow erosion of trust. And most of the time, no one connects these problems to their root cause, a deficit of emotional intelligence at the top. Now, some managers hear the phrase emotional intelligence and immediately resist. They worry that paying attention to feelings will make them soft, will undermine their authority, will prevent them from making the tough calls that business requires. Goleman addresses this head-on. A study of 250 executives found that most believed their jobs demanded their heads but not their hearts. One executive said the idea of empathizing with his employees would be impossible. It would prevent him from doing his job. But the evidence tells a very different story. The managers who are most effective are not the ones who bulldoze through every interaction. They're the ones who can motivate, inspire, and bring out the best in the people around them. Leadership is not domination. It's the art of persuading people to work toward a common goal. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the art of giving criticism, which Goleman calls one of the most important tasks a manager has, and one of the most frequently botched. A seasoned engineer spent months leading his team on a software development project. When it was time to present their work to the company's vice president, the entire team gathered, proud of what they'd accomplished. But after the presentation, the vice president turned to the engineer and asked sarcastically, "How long have you been out of graduate school? These specifications are ridiculous." The engineer sat in stunned silence for the rest of the meeting. For the next 2 weeks, he was consumed by the remark. Dispirited, depressed, convinced he'd never get another important assignment. He was thinking of quitting. Finally, he went back to the vice president and asked what he'd been trying to accomplish. The VP was genuinely astonished. He hadn't meant to be devastating. He actually thought the plan was promising. It just needed more work. He had no idea his offhand remark had been so destructive. This is what happens when feedback is delivered without emotional intelligence. The VP failed to consider how his words would land. He didn't think about the emotional impact, the public humiliation, the loss of confidence, the demoralization of the entire team. And the cost wasn't just one engineer's feelings. It was weeks of lost productivity, damaged morale, and a team member who nearly walked out the door. Goleman, drawing on the work of psychoanalyst Harry Levinson, lays out what artful criticism looks like. Be specific. Don't say you're doing something wrong. Say exactly what the problem is and how it could be improved. Offer a solution. Criticism without a path forward just creates helplessness. Be present, deliver it face to face, not in a memo. And above all, be sensitive. Be attuned to how the other person is receiving what you're saying. This advice mirrors exactly what works in marriage. In fact, Goleman points out that destructive criticism at work follows the same patterns as destructive conflict at home. Personal attacks instead of specific complaints, contempt instead of respect, defensiveness, and stonewalling instead of dialogue. The emotional dynamics are identical, and so are the solutions. Beyond individual relationships, Goleman makes a broader argument about how emotional intelligence shapes entire organizations. He points to a fascinating study at Bell Labs, the legendary scientific think tank near Princeton. Everyone who works there is brilliant. They've all been selected for exceptional academic IQ. But within that pool of genius, some engineers are stars while others are average performers. What makes the difference? It's not academic talent. When researchers compared the stars with everyone else, they found virtually no meaningful difference in IQ, personality tests, or cognitive measures. The critical difference was emotional intelligence. The stars were better at motivating themselves, they were better at building relationships, and most importantly, they were better at working their informal networks. Here's what that means in practice. When a middle-performing engineer at Bell Labs got stuck on a technical problem, he would send emails and leave voicemails for experts around the company, and then wait and wait. Days would pass with no response. But when a star engineer got stuck, the phone call came back almost immediately. Why? Because the stars had invested time in building genuine relationships with key people long before they needed help. They had cultivated trust, offered their own expertise freely, and created a web of mutual obligation. When the crisis came, they could activate that network in minutes. Think about that. In one of the most intellectually demanding environments on Earth, the factor that separated exceptional performance from ordinary performance wasn't brain power. It was the ability to connect with people, to build trust, and to collaborate effectively. It was emotional intelligence operating at the organizational level. And this insight extends far beyond Bell Labs. As the economy shifts increasingly toward knowledge work, where value comes from ideas, collaboration, and creative problem solving rather than physical labor, the ability to work well with others is becoming not just an advantage but a survival skill. The lone genius working in isolation is a romantic fantasy. The reality of modern work is teams, networks, and the emotional glue that holds them together. Section 10. Mind and medicine. How emotions affect your health. Goleman opens this section with a personal story that anyone who has ever been frightened by a doctor's visit will recognize. During a routine checkup, traces of blood were found in his urine. His doctor mentioned several diagnostic tests and used the word cytology, cancer. That's all Goleman's mind could hear. His thoughts froze. The doctor was still talking, explaining where to go, what to do. But the instructions went in one ear and out the other. Goleman had to ask the doctor to repeat the simplest information 3 or 4 times. His cognitive machinery had been hijacked by fear. At the hospital, a nephrologist ran the tests, then hurried off without telling Goleman the results. Goleman, shaken and dazed, couldn't bring himself to ask the question that had been eating at him all morning. Fortunately, a friend who had come along, a physician himself, asked it for him. "Doctor, my friend's father died of bladder cancer. He's anxious to know if you saw any signs of cancer in the x-rays." The answer was no. No abnormalities. But Goleman's inability to ask that single question, the one he cared about most, is repeated 1,000 times each day in hospitals everywhere. Studies have found that patients go into a doctor's visit with an average of 3 or more questions on their mind. They leave with only 1.5 answered. The fear, the vulnerability, the overwhelming sense of helplessness that comes with being sick, all of it conspires to shut down the very communication that patients need most. But Goleman's argument in this section goes far deeper than bedside manner. He presents a growing body of scientific evidence that emotions don't just affect how we experience illness, they can affect whether we get sick in the first place and how quickly we recover. The science begins with a discovery that rewrote our understanding of the body. In 1974, psychologist Robert Ader at the University of Rochester found something that, according to the best medical knowledge of the time, should have been impossible. He found that the immune system could learn. The prevailing wisdom had been that the brain and the immune system were completely separate entities, two independent systems that had no way to communicate with each other. But Ader gave laboratory rats a medication that suppressed their immune cells, always paired with saccharin-flavored water. Eventually, the saccharin water alone, without any medication, was enough to suppress the rats' immune systems. Some of the rats got sick and died, simply from drinking sweetened water. Their immune system had learned to shut down in response to a taste. This single finding launched the field of psychoneuroimmunology, the study of how the mind, the nervous system, and the immune system interact. And what researchers discovered in the years that followed was that these systems are not just connected, they are deeply intertwined. Nerve endings from the autonomic nervous system make direct physical contact with immune cells. The same stress hormones that flood the body during emotional distress, catecholamines, cortisol, norepinephrine, directly suppress immune function. The clinical implications are staggering. A massive analysis combining results from 101 studies found that people who experienced chronic anxiety, prolonged sadness, unremitting tension, or persistent hostility had double the risk of disease, including asthma, arthritis, headaches, ulcers, and heart disease. Double. That makes chronic emotional distress as toxic a risk factor as smoking or high cholesterol. Let's look at the specifics. Anger may be the single most dangerous emotion for your heart. In a Stanford University study, heart patients were asked to recall incidents that made them angry. While they described those memories, the pumping efficiency of their hearts dropped by 5% or more, a range that cardiologists consider a sign of dangerous reduction in blood flow to the heart muscle. And the patients said they were only about half as angry during the retelling as they'd been during the actual events. Imagine what the full-blown fury had done. At Duke University, researcher Redford Williams found that physicians who scored highest on hostility tests during medical school were 7 times more likely to have died by age 50 than their more easygoing peers. 7 times. Hostility was a stronger predictor of early death than smoking, high blood pressure, or high cholesterol. A Harvard Medical School study of over 1,500 heart attack survivors found that being angry more than doubled the risk of another cardiac arrest in the hours that followed, and the heightened risk lasted for about 2 hours after the anger flared. Now think about anxiety. Psychologist Sheldon Cohen, working with scientists at a specialized cold research unit in England, systematically exposed volunteers to a cold virus and tracked who actually got sick. Among people with little stress in their lives, 27% caught the cold. Among those with the most stress, 47%. Stress didn't just make people feel worse, it measurably weakened the immune barriers that were supposed to protect them. And then there's depression. A study of heart attack patients found that those who were seriously depressed had a death rate 5 times higher in the following 6 months than those who weren't depressed. An effect as powerful as the most dangerous medical risk factors. Depression doesn't just make you feel bad. In serious illness, it can literally kill you. But here's where the story turns hopeful. If negative emotions are toxic, positive emotions appear to be tonic. Optimistic heart bypass patients recovered faster and had fewer complications than pessimistic ones. People with high hope who were paralyzed by spinal injuries achieved greater physical mobility than equally injured patients who felt less hopeful. The mind doesn't just poison the body, it can help heal it. And perhaps the most powerful medicine of all is human connection. Studies involving more than 37,000 people over 2 decades found that social isolation, the feeling that you have no one to turn to, no one to share your deepest worries with, doubles your risk of sickness and death. Doubles it. That makes loneliness a greater health risk than smoking. In a Swedish study, all the men born in 1933 in the city of Göteborg were offered a free medical exam. 7 years later, researchers checked back. The men who had reported intense emotional stress had a death rate 3 times higher than those who said their lives were calm. But, and this is the crucial part, among those men who said they had a dependable web of intimacy, a wife, close friends, people they could confide in, There was no relationship between stress and death rate. None. Having people to turn to completely neutralized the lethal effects of stress. And then there is the study that may be the most remarkable finding in this entire book. At Stanford University Medical School, Dr. David Spiegel set up weekly support groups for women with advanced metastatic breast cancer, cancer that had spread and could not be cured. All the women received standard medical treatment. The only difference was that some also attended these weekly meetings where they could share their fears, their pain, and their anger with others who truly understood. The women who attended the support groups lived an average of 37 months after the study began. The women who faced the disease alone lived an average of 19 months. The simple act of having a safe space to express their emotions, to feel heard, to feel connected, nearly doubled their survival time. No medication on earth could match that outcome. This is why Goleman argues that medicine needs to expand its vision of health. Treating the body while ignoring the emotional reality of the patient is incomplete medicine. Teaching people to manage anger, reduce anxiety, and build supportive relationships isn't a luxury. It's disease prevention. And for patients who are already sick, attending to their emotional needs isn't just compassionate, it's clinically effective. Section 11. Windows of opportunity. Family, trauma, and temperament. We've talked about emotional intelligence in adults, in marriages, in workplaces, in hospitals. But the question that may matter most is this: where does it begin? How do the emotional patterns that shape an entire lifetime first take root? Goleman devotes the final third of his book to this question, and his answer is both urgent and hopeful. Emotional intelligence begins in the family. It's shaped by how parents handle their own feelings and how they respond to their children's feelings. And the window for this learning is far more critical and far more time-sensitive than most parents realize. Consider this scene. 5-year-old Leslie is trying to play a new video game. Her parents, Carl and Anne, hover over her, firing contradictory commands. To the right, stop, stop. Anne's voice grows more anxious by the second. Put it to the left, Carl brusquely orders. Leslie can't please either of them. Her jaw tightens, her eyes fill with tears. But neither parent notices. They've started bickering with each other. She's not moving the stick that much, Anne snaps at Carl. Leslie raises her hand to wipe her tears. Her father snaps, put your hand back on the stick. You want to get ready to shoot? Her mother barks, move it just a teeny bit. By now, Leslie is sobbing softly, alone with her anguish. Neither parent makes any move that suggests they notice or care. Goleman says the message Leslie is learning in this moment, a message that, if repeated across hundreds of similar interactions, will shape her emotional architecture for years, is devastating in its simplicity. Nobody cares about my feelings. Research teams at the University of Washington studied exactly this kind of parent-child interaction. They found that parents fall into roughly 4 categories when it comes to handling their children's emotions. Some parents ignore feelings altogether, treating a child's distress as trivial, something that will blow over on its own. They miss the opportunity to connect. Some are laissez-faire. They notice the child is upset, but figure any response the child has is fine. They don't step in to help the child learn better ways to cope. Some are contemptuous, disapproving, and harsh. They punish emotional expression. The child who shows anger gets yelled at. The child who shows fear gets shamed. And then there's the 4th type, the emotion coaches. These are parents who take their child's feelings seriously. When their child is upset, they don't dismiss it or punish it. They get curious. Are you angry because Tommy hurt your feelings? They help the child name the emotion, understand it, and find constructive ways to deal with it. Instead of hitting him, why don't you find a toy to play with on your own until you feel like playing with him again? The children of emotion coaching parents showed advantages across the board. They got along better with peers. They had fewer behavioral problems. They performed better academically. They were more popular with other children. Their teachers rated them as more socially skilled. And here's the biological finding. They had lower levels of stress hormones. Their bodies were literally calmer. The implications are profound. Holding IQ constant, 5-year-olds whose parents were skilled emotion coaches had higher achievement scores in math and reading by 3rd grade. Emotional parenting didn't just produce nicer kids, it produced kids who learned better. But what about the children on the other end of the spectrum? The ones whose emotional education is not just absent but actively harmful. Goleman describes research on children who have been physically abused, and the findings are chilling. In a daycare center, researchers observed how toddlers responded when another child nearby started crying. Among children from normal homes, the typical response was concern. They would approach the crying child, offer comfort, try to help. Among children who had been abused, the response was completely different. Not one of them showed concern. Instead, they reacted with fear, anger, or physical aggression. A 2.5-year-old boy named Martin heard a playmate crying. He approached her and reached for her hand. She pulled away. Martin slapped her arm. When she continued crying, he began yelling, "Cut it out! Cut it out!" his voice getting louder and faster. He tried patting her back, but the pats turned into pounding. He kept hitting her as she screamed. Martin had learned this response at home. His attempts at comfort, reaching out, patting, were the opening moves. But when they didn't work, the only escalation pattern he knew was violence. He was replaying the script that had been written on his emotional brain by the adults who were supposed to protect him. This failure of empathy in abused children is not just sad, it's dangerous. Studies tracking aggressive children from grade school into adulthood found that the most belligerent children were the most likely to have criminal records by age 30, and they passed the pattern to their own children, who became the troublemakers of the next generation. Violence begets violence, not through genes, but through emotional learning. Now, does this mean emotional damage in childhood is permanent? This is where Goleman turns to the science of trauma and resilience, and the answer is genuinely hopeful. Even the most severe emotional wounds can heal. The brain remains plastic throughout life. The neural circuits of the emotional brain can be reshaped by new experiences, new relationships, and deliberate relearning. The evidence comes from studies of the most extreme cases: Holocaust survivors, combat veterans with PTSD, children who witnessed school shootings. At Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton, California, a gunman opened fire on the playground during morning recess. For 7 minutes, bullets tore across the schoolyard. 5 children died. 29 were wounded. In the months that followed, the surviving children showed all the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder: nightmares, hypervigilance, paralyzing fear triggered by any sound or sight remotely connected to the shooting. An ambulance siren would freeze every child in the building. A swinging tetherball chain that sounded vaguely like gunfire sent a girl running to the principal in a panic. But something else happened too. The children spontaneously began playing a game they called Purdy, named after the gunman. In this game, they reenacted the shooting over and over. Sometimes the villain kills the children, sometimes the children kill Purdy. It was macabre, disturbing, and deeply therapeutic, because this repetitive play was doing something the children's conscious minds couldn't do on their own. It was giving them a chance to revisit the trauma in a context they controlled, to rehearse different outcomes, to slowly desensitize the amygdala's hair-trigger alarm response. Art, play, storytelling. These are the languages the emotional brain speaks, and through them, even the most searing memories can gradually lose their power. Psychiatrist Judith Herman outlines 3 stages of recovery from trauma. First, regaining a sense of safety, learning that your body and your world are not constantly under threat. Second, retelling the story of the trauma, putting words to what happened, bringing unconscious emotional memories under conscious control. And third, mourning what was lost and rebuilding a life no longer defined by the trauma. This sequence works because it directly addresses how the emotional brain encodes and retrieves traumatic memories. The amygdala stores the raw emotional charge. The neocortex, when it's functioning well, provides context, meaning, and a sense of proportion. In trauma, the connection between the two is disrupted. The emotional memory fires without context. A car backfires and you're back in combat. Therapy restores that connection. It teaches the thinking brain to modulate the emotional brain's alarm signals. The fear doesn't disappear completely, but the response to it changes. And this brings us to the question of temperament. Jerome Kagan, a developmental psychologist at Harvard, has shown that roughly 15 to 20% of children are born with what he calls behavioral inhibition, a biological tendency toward timidity. Their amygdalas are unusually excitable. From birth, they are more reactive to anything unfamiliar. New faces, new situations, new sounds. Their hearts beat faster, their stress hormones run higher, and their instinct is to withdraw. But here's the remarkable finding. About 1 in 3 of these timid children outgrow their fearfulness by kindergarten. They become bolder, more confident, more willing to engage with the world. What made the difference? Their parents. Kagan found that mothers who gently pushed their timid children to face small challenges, not forcing them, but not overprotecting them either, produced children who learned to manage their anxiety. The child who was encouraged to approach a new playmate, even when scared, practiced mastery over fear in small doses. Over hundreds of such encounters, the prefrontal cortex learned to override the amygdala's hair trigger. But mothers who rushed to protect their timid babies from every discomfort, who picked them up the instant they fretted, who shielded them from anything unfamiliar, produced children who remained fearful. By trying to spare their children the experience of distress, they deprived them of the chance to learn that distress is survivable. Temperament is not destiny. That's one of the most important sentences in this book. Your genes may determine your starting point, but your experiences, especially in childhood, determine the trajectory. The brain's frontal lobes, the seat of emotional self-regulation, continue developing well into late adolescence. That means childhood and the teenage years represent a critical window, a window during which emotional habits are being sculpted into neural architecture that will last a lifetime. The skills that matter: empathy, impulse control, self-awareness, the ability to soothe yourself when upset. These aren't just nice traits to have. They are competencies that the brain is literally wired to learn during specific developmental windows. Miss the window, and the lesson becomes harder to absorb later. This doesn't mean it's impossible. The brain retains plasticity throughout life, but it means we're running against the clock with every child who grows up without these essential emotional tools. And that raises a question that Goleman calls the most urgent of all. If emotional intelligence can be learned, and if the window for learning it is childhood, then what happens to the millions of children who never get these lessons? What is the cost of emotional illiteracy? To them and to all of us. Section 12. The cost of emotional illiteracy. It began as a small dispute. Ian Moore and Tyrone Sinclair, students at Thomas Jefferson High School in Brooklyn, had a falling out with a classmate, 15-year-old Khalil Sumter. They started picking on him, making threats. Khalil grew terrified that Ian and Tyrone were going to beat him up. So one morning, Khalil brought a .38 caliber pistol to school. And 15 feet from a school security guard, in the hallway between classes, he shot both boys to death at point-blank range. 3 lives destroyed in a moment. 2 boys dead, 1 boy facing a lifetime behind bars. And somewhere in the wreckage of that hallway, a question that no one seemed to be asking loudly enough. Not, how did he get the gun? Though that matters. But something more fundamental. How did 3 teenage boys arrive at a moment where none of them had any idea how to resolve a conflict without violence? Where was the moment when someone could have taught Khalil to manage his terror? Where was the moment when someone could have shown Ian and Tyrone that threats have consequences far beyond what they imagined? Goleman argues that this shooting, and thousands of incidents like it, is a symptom of something much larger. Not just a failure of gun policy or school security, but a failure of emotional education, a generation of children growing up without the most basic skills for handling their own feelings and navigating their relationships. And the data he presents is sobering. A national survey compared American children's emotional health in the mid-1970s with the late 1980s, based on assessments from both parents and teachers. On every single measure, children were doing worse. Not on 1 or 2 indicators, on all of them. More withdrawn, more anxious, more aggressive, more impulsive, more lonely, more depressed, less able to pay attention, less able to control themselves. The decline cut across every demographic, rich and poor, urban and suburban, every racial and ethnic group. This isn't just an American problem. Studies in the Netherlands, China, Germany, Australia, France, and Thailand found comparable or even worse rates. Something about modern life. The erosion of extended families, the pressure of two working parents, the hours children spend alone with screens, the fraying of community bonds, is systematically depriving children of the emotional education that was once woven into the fabric of everyday life. And the consequences ripple outward into every problem we claim to care about. Take aggression. Children who are highly aggressive in grade school, the bullies, the troublemakers, the kids who see hostility in every neutral interaction, are on a trajectory that is grimly predictable. By the time they're teenagers, they're 3 times more likely than their peers to have shoplifted, used a weapon, or beaten someone up. Many drop out of school. Many end up with criminal records. And perhaps most troublingly, they pass the pattern to their own children, who become the next generation's playground aggressors. But here's what's critical to understand. These children aren't just mean. They're emotionally miscalibrated. Research shows that aggressive children have a specific perceptual bias. They see hostility where none exists. An innocent bump in the hallway becomes an intentional attack. A neutral facial expression becomes a threat. Their emotional brain is scanning the world through a filter of danger, and that filter was usually installed by the harsh, unpredictable discipline they received at home. They learned that the world is hostile, and then they find evidence for that belief everywhere they look. Depression tells a similar story. Each generation born since 1900 has faced a higher risk of major depression than the one before it. The age of onset keeps dropping, and Goleman traces a key mechanism: not just life circumstances, but thinking patterns. Children who develop a pessimistic explanatory style, who interpret setbacks as permanent, personal, and pervasive, are far more vulnerable to depression when difficulty strikes. But the hopeful discovery is that these thinking patterns can be changed. In one study, mildly depressed high school students went through an 8-week after-school program that taught them to challenge their pessimistic thoughts, build better relationships, and engage in activities they enjoyed. By the end of the program, 55% had recovered from their depression, compared to only about a quarter of equally depressed students who didn't go through the program. And a year later, the students who had learned these skills were half as likely to have fallen into a major depressive episode. Half as likely? 8 weeks of emotional skill building cut the risk of serious depression in half. Similar patterns emerge with eating disorders. A study of over 900 adolescent girls found that the strongest predictor of developing anorexia or bulimia wasn't controlling parents or low self-esteem, it was the inability to distinguish among emotions. Girls who couldn't tell the difference between anxiety, anger, and hunger were the ones most likely to turn to food, or the refusal of food as a way to manage feelings they couldn't name. And substance abuse follows the same emotional thread. Many addicts describe their first experience with a drug as the first time they felt normal. The anxious teenager who discovers that alcohol calms the storm inside him. The chronically depressed young woman who finds that cocaine lifts the fog. The angry young man who discovers that opiates finally quiet the rage. They're not choosing to be addicts. They're self-medicating emotional pain that no one ever taught them to handle any other way. Psychologist Ralph Tarter put it bluntly: for people who are biologically predisposed, that first drink or dose is immensely reinforcing in a way that others simply don't experience. They've found a chemical solution to an emotional problem. And the devil's bargain of addiction, short-term relief in exchange for long-term destruction, takes hold before they ever see the trade they're making. What ties all of these problems together? Aggression, depression, eating disorders, substance abuse, social isolation is a common thread. Not poverty alone, though poverty makes everything worse. Not bad parenting alone, though that plays a role. The common thread is a deficit in emotional competence. Children who can't identify what they're feeling, who can't manage their impulses, who can't read the social cues around them, who can't resolve a disagreement without violence or withdrawal, who never learned that feelings are not facts, that moods can be changed, that there are always more options than the first one that comes to mind. And if the deficit is emotional, then the solution must be emotional too. Not another war on drugs, not another crackdown on violence, not another program that delivers information without building skills. What's needed? Goleman argues, is something much more fundamental and much more hopeful. We need to teach children the language of emotions the way we teach them the language of math and reading. We need emotional literacy as a core part of education. Section 13. Schooling the emotions. It's a regular school day at the Nueva School in California, and a group of 5th graders is sitting in a circle on the floor. Their teacher, Joan Vargo, divides them into teams for a cooperative jigsaw puzzle game. The catch is they have to work together in complete silence, with no gesturing allowed. One group finishes quickly. Another struggles but finds its rhythm. But the third group is stuck. The tension mounts, and then a boy named Raman picks up 2 puzzle pieces and holds them in front of his eyes like a mask. His teammates laugh. The frustration breaks, just for a moment. What follows is a small drama that reveals how emotional intelligence is actually taught, not through lectures, but through life. After the game, Raman discovers that Tucker, the group's observer, has written his name next to the word disruptive on an evaluation sheet. Raman is upset. His voice gets tight. Tucker gets defensive. The temperature between them rises. This is the moment that matters. In most classrooms, this exchange would either escalate into a fight or be shut down by an authority figure. But in this class, a class called self-science, the teacher does something different. She steps in, not to punish or dismiss, but to coach. She says to Tucker, "Try to say what you mean in a tone that doesn't sound so critical." She says to Raman, "I appreciate that you're being assertive. You're not attacking, but you're standing up for yourself." She helps each boy see the other's perspective. Tucker didn't mean disruptive as an insult. He meant that Raman was lightening the mood during a frustrating moment. Raman heard the word as a label, a judgment on his character. Neither boy was wrong. They were just missing each other's meaning. By the end of the exchange, both boys are nodding. Raman says he feels okay. Tucker is smiling. And then they turn and run off together to their next class. Think about what just happened. 2 boys on the edge of a conflict used real skills, naming their feelings, listening to each other, expressing their grievance without attacking, and accepting each other's perspective to resolve a dispute that could easily have become a fight. They didn't learn these skills from a textbook. They practiced them in a moment of genuine emotional heat, with a teacher who knew how to guide them through it. This is what emotional literacy education looks like, and Goleman argues it should be happening in every school in the country. The specifics vary from program to program, but the core skills are remarkably consistent. Self-awareness, learning to recognize and name your emotions, to understand what triggers them, and to see the connection between what you think, what you feel, and what you do. Self-management, learning to handle anger without exploding, to tolerate frustration, to calm yourself when you're overwhelmed. Empathy, learning to read other people's feelings from their words, their faces, and their body language. And social skills, learning to listen, to communicate without attacking, to resolve conflicts, to cooperate. One of the tools Goleman highlights is brilliantly simple. It's called the stoplight method. A poster displayed in the classroom shows a traffic light with 6 steps: red light, stop, calm down, and think before you act. Yellow light, say the problem and how you feel, set a positive goal, think of lots of solutions, and think ahead to the consequences. Green light, go ahead and try the best plan. It sounds almost too simple. But when children practice this process over and over, across years of schooling, something happens. It becomes automatic. It becomes the voice in their head when the emotional brain is screaming at them to lash out, to withdraw, to give up. It becomes a habit that overrides the impulse, not by suppressing the feeling, but by creating a pause between the feeling and the action. And in that pause, everything changes. And the results? When independent evaluations pooled the findings from emotional literacy programs across the country, the improvements covered virtually every dimension of a child's life. Better recognition and management of emotions, fewer fights and disruptions, less loneliness and social anxiety, more empathy and concern for others, more cooperation and skill in resolving conflicts, better ability to focus and pay attention, and here is the finding that should make every school administrator sit up and pay attention: improved academic achievement scores. Emotional literacy doesn't compete with academic education. it supports it. Children who can manage their impulses can sit still long enough to learn. Children who can handle frustration don't give up on difficult problems. Children who can read social cues work better in groups. Children who feel confident and connected are more willing to take the intellectual risks that real learning requires. Key takeaways. We've covered a lot of ground. So let me draw out the ideas from this book that I believe have the power to genuinely change how you see yourself, your relationships, and your life. The first takeaway. You have two minds, and they both matter. Your rational mind and your emotional mind are not opponents, they're partners. The emotional brain can hijack the rational one in an instant, triggering reactions you'll regret before your thinking mind even knows what happened. But without emotional input, the rational mind can't make decisions at all. The goal isn't to silence your emotions, it's to harmonize them with your thinking, to bring intelligence to your emotions and emotional depth to your intelligence. The second takeaway: IQ is not destiny. It contributes about 20% to life success. The rest, the vast majority, depends on emotional skills, self-awareness, self-control, motivation, empathy, and social competence. These are the skills that determine whether someone with talent actually uses it, whether someone with intelligence actually applies it, whether someone with opportunity actually seizes it. And unlike IQ, these skills can be learned and improved at any age. The third takeaway: self-awareness is the foundation of everything. You cannot manage what you cannot see. The ability to notice what you're feeling as you're feeling it is the keystone skill. It gives you choice. Without it, your emotions run on autopilot and you spend your life reacting instead of responding. With it, you can catch the anger before it becomes an outburst, notice the anxiety before it becomes paralysis, and recognize the sadness before it becomes a spiral. The fourth takeaway: you can't choose what emotions hit you, but you can choose how long they stay. Anger feeds on angry thoughts. Interrupt the thoughts, and the anger fades. Depression feeds on rumination. Break the cycle with distraction, exercise, or helping someone else. Anxiety feeds on catastrophic imagining. Challenge the assumptions and the worry loses its grip. The key in every case is the same. Don't suppress the feeling, but don't let it drive the car. The fifth takeaway: impulse control is the master skill. The marshmallow test showed it with devastating clarity. A 4-year-old's ability to wait for a treat predicted their academic success, their social competence, and their emotional resilience 14 years later. The ability to pause between impulse and action, to feel the urge without obeying it, is the foundation of self-discipline, persistence, and every form of achievement that requires sustained effort over time. The sixth takeaway: hope and optimism are not personality traits, they're skills. Optimists don't see the world through rose-colored glasses, they interpret setbacks differently. They see failure as temporary and specific rather than permanent and pervasive, and this difference in interpretation changes everything: how quickly they bounce back, how hard they try, and ultimately how far they go. The good news is that explanatory style can be taught. Pessimism is a habit of thought, not a life sentence. The seventh takeaway: empathy is the root of all connection. It builds on self-awareness. The more attuned you are to your own emotions, the better you read other people's. Over 90% of emotional communication is nonverbal. The people who can read those signals, the tone, the posture, the flicker across someone's face, are more effective in every relationship and every social situation. And the people who can't are left wondering why the world seems so confusing. The eighth takeaway: your emotions can make you sick or help you heal. Chronic anger, anxiety, and depression are as toxic to your body as smoking or high cholesterol. Social isolation doubles your risk of death, but positive emotions, genuine human connection, and the simple act of having someone who truly listens can measurably strengthen your immune system and extend your life. The body and mind are not separate systems. They are one system, and they're listening to each other constantly. The ninth takeaway: marriage is the ultimate test of emotional intelligence. The couples who last aren't the ones who never fight. They're the ones who fight well. They calm down before they're flooded. They complain about behavior without attacking character. They listen without immediately defending. They find ways to validate each other even in disagreement. And they practice these skills when emotions are calm, so they're available when emotions are not. And the 10th takeaway, the one that may matter most: emotional intelligence is shaped in childhood, and the window is more critical than most of us realize. The brain's emotional circuits are being sculpted throughout childhood and adolescence. The lessons a child absorbs about how feelings are handled, from parents, from teachers, from peers, from the culture around them, become the neural architecture they'll carry into every relationship and challenge for the rest of their lives. Teaching children to recognize their emotions, manage their impulses, empathize with others, and resolve conflicts peacefully is not a nice extra. It is the most important education we can give them. And here's the truth that sits underneath all 10 of these ideas. Emotional intelligence is not some rare gift that a lucky few are born with. It's a set of skills that can be learned, practiced, and passed on. The science is clear. The programs exist. The evidence shows they work. The only question is whether we'll make the choice to teach them. Closing. Daniel Goleman wrote this book in 1995, and in the decades since, the science has only grown stronger. The programs have spread to schools around the world. The concept of emotional intelligence has entered the mainstream in business, in education, in therapy, and in how we think about what it means to live a good life. But the core insight remains as urgent today as it was when Goleman first put it on the page. We live in a world that tests our emotional skills every single day, in our marriages, our workplaces, our parenting, our politics, and in the quiet moments when we're alone with our own minds. And for too long, we've left the development of those skills to chance. So let me leave you with a question. Think about the most important relationship in your life right now, whether it's with a partner, a child, a friend, or a colleague. What is one emotional skill, just one, that if you practiced it consistently, would make that relationship better? Maybe it's listening without defending. Maybe it's naming what you feel before reacting to it. Maybe it's pausing when you're angry instead of saying the thing you'll regret. Whatever it is, that's your marshmallow moment. The choice between the impulse and the pause, between reacting and responding, between who you've been and who you could become. If this summary brought you something valuable, I'd love for you to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new book. And if you want to go deeper, I highly recommend picking up a copy of Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman. You'll find links to Amazon and Audible in the description below. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one. And remember, you are always just one book away.